Astride a busy road in Flanders, under the canopy of some oak trees, lies one of the largest German cemeteries from the First World War. Its story runs like a dark thread through the history of the 20th century. So what do we know of Langemarck German Cemetery, and what myths surround this potent symbol of German sacrifice? This week we return to Flanders, and we're going to be up in the northern area of the Ypres battlefields, walking the grounds into and through the village of Langemarck, ending at the German cemetery there, where we'll look at the way in which the Germans commemorated their dead from the Great War in Flanders, and we'll also look at some of the myths, the many myths, connected to the cemetery at Langemarck. But we're beginning our walk on the road between the villages of Bozinger and Langemarck at Cement House Cemetery, so a British Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery from the Great War. This is one of the larger ones in this area. There are 3,592 burials here. But as you go in through the archway entrance and you begin to look amongst the rows, it very quickly becomes apparent that the vast majority of the men buried in here are unidentified. In fact, there are 2,425 out of those 3,592 who are unidentified graves. So the vast majority are not known. This was a cemetery that takes its name from a concrete bunker that was close by, that was used as a medical facility during the Third Battle of Ypres, and when you look at the original graves here, they are mainly from that period. It was chosen to become a concentration cemetery for this area of the battlefield, but it took on a much greater significance following the Second World War. From the end of World War II up until the 1990s, there were only two open cemeteries, British cemeteries, on the Western Front, one in France and one here in Belgium. In France, it was Turlington Cemetery near Boulogne, and Cement House, where we are now, was the one in Belgium. And what that meant was that between the end of the Second World War and up until the last years of the previous century, any soldiers who were found on the battlefields of Belgium, or any graves that required moving and couldn't be concentrated into a nearby cemetery, were brought here. So this cemetery is not just for the battlefields around Ypres. There are men from a very wide area of Belgium buried in here, including, for example, men who were killed in the Battle of Mons, the first British engagement of the Great War. But amongst those graves that were made here in the half-century from the end of World War II until the Commission's policy and the way it buried the dead changed, rather than burying them in one cemetery like this, they would bury men that were found on the battlefields as close as possible to where they were found, or in cemeteries that were connected to their story where, for example, there were graves of their mates who died in the same action. So when we look at those graves of men found from the 1950s up until the early 2000s, we're looking at the graves of men found in agricultural work, so by farmers, in building work. This particular part of the battlefields saw a lot of construction, particularly in the 1970s and 80s, and quite a few soldiers' remains were found during that period. But there's one plot, as we come through that main entrance again and go to our left, right down to the far end of the cemetery, there's a little section that's slightly at a different angle to the rest of the graves. And these are the men that were found by the diggers, that group of amateur Belgian archaeologists that excavated the battlefields around Bozinger in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And when I stand here, many of these men I saw the work that the diggers were doing, and in particular two men of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, which I discussed in one of the very early episodes of the Old Front Line. This was a dig that was done for a television programme, Meet the Ancestors BBC Archaeology Special, in which we followed the work of the diggers and the incredible task that they were performing by carrying out rescue archaeology on this battlefield and also recovering the remains of many, many soldiers who had died here. It included these two Royal Welsh Fusiliers, which it took 8.5 hours for them to properly excavate the graves. Those are 8.5 hours of my life that I will never forget, seeing gradually the story of these men and their death emerging from the Flanders mud. So when we look in a cemetery like this, where there are so many men who were buried long after the war ended, with them are so many tales. Leaving the cemetery, we come out onto the main road. It's quite a busy road, this one, and not normally the sort of road that I like walking along. But a little bit further up on the left-hand side, there's a cart track that takes us across the fields. And we can follow this past a modern farm complex on the left-hand side, close to a position marked on 1917 trench maps as Cardiff Castle. And it brings us up onto a tarmac road called Donkerweg. And from here, we've got a very, very good vantage point over this part of the battlefields. Standing here, we're now looking towards the village of Langemarck itself. To get some perspective on where we are, if we look over our shoulder to our right, we can see in the far distance the spires of Ypres, the tall spire of St Martin's Cathedral, and the clock tower of the Cloth Hall. Ahead of us, we can see Langemarck Church. Over to our left, the ground rises slightly and we can see an embankment, and that's the old railway line. Now, there were no trains running here in 1917, but as the battle moved on beyond Langemarck, this became an approach route to the front line. Ahead of us, just beyond the modern farm, we can see the ground dip slightly, and here it dips into the Steenbeek River. Not much more of a stream, really, as we'll see fairly shortly, but in 1917, with all the tremendous bombardments here, it was smashed to pieces, and it flooded because it was raining from the night of the 31st of July 1917, the first day of the Third Battle of Ypres, or what we call the Battle of Passchendaele. And that rain had to go somewhere, and it went into the shell holes, and it went into the shattered ground around this flooded stream. On that first day of the battle here, 2 divisions were involved in the attack in this area. Over to our right, the 38th Welsh Division. They'd advanced from the area around where Yorkshire Trench is, on the industrial estate today, just north of Ypres. So on the slopes of the Pilkelm Ridge, up and through the German defences there. Their advance had been slowed down substantially by the large number of concrete machine gun positions that were in that area, many of which can be seen today. Over to our left and ahead of us were the Guards Division. They'd come from the join between British forces and French forces on the northern sector of the battlefield. They'd advanced through similar German defences, but not quite as many concrete bunkers, and they had reached their final objective line, which was that Steenbeek River. Eventually, the Welsh troops did also catch up and reach that position on the night of the 31st of July, but behind schedule. And what it meant was the whole momentum of the attack in this area was not quite as far forward, perhaps, as it should have been. So while the leap forward on the 31st of July 1917 had been quite significant in this area of the battlefield, the fact that the Germans now had time to react and reinforce their positions here meant that this would take much longer to move across the next bit of ground. And when we look at this side of the village of Langemarck, that's the first day of the battle, it took really until September of 1917 for the far side of Langemarck to be reached. So you can see how slow the progress was following the initial stage of the assault. Part of this was to do with the strengthening of the German positions, part of it was also to do with the conditions on the battlefield. As I mentioned, the Steenbeek River had flooded, the ground here was smashed to pieces by the tremendous bombardments of 1917, and when we think of a battle like Passchendaele, we think of these vast wastelands of shell craters, a moonscape, and with the shell craters full of mud and muck and slime, and that is exactly what this battlefield looked like. In the next stage of the battle that took place here, on the 16th of August 1917, the so-called crossing of the Steenbeek River, 2 new divisions were brought up. The 29th Division, which had been famous for its exploits at Gallipoli in 1915, and had taken part in the Battle of the Somme in 1916 and had been at Arras earlier in 1917. And here on the 16th of August, its battalions of units like the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, the Royal Fusiliers, the King's Own Scottish Borderers, they crossed this bit of ground we can see ahead of us to our left towards where the modern factory is located in very, very difficult conditions, but pushed forward to the next bit of ground just beyond Langemarck village. Over to our right, men from the 20th Light Division attacked across the Steenbeek into the outskirts of Langemarck to the south. This was a light infantry division, so it was made up of battalions of light infantry regiments like the Duke of Cornwall's light infantry, the Rifle Brigade, the King's Royal Rifle Corps, and in the advance of the 16th of August, the line of their advance in many respects was held up by a substantial German bunker complex in this area called Object. It was a double or even a triple tiered machine gun position that was causing heavy casualties. and a soldier of the King's Royal Rifle Corps, Edward Cooper, was awarded the Victoria Cross for his bravery in capturing this position almost single-handedly on that day. Cooper was the only Victoria Cross winner of the Great War that I had the pleasure of meeting and interviewing, and he said that as he advanced across that ground and saw his mates drop around him, something just took him over and he rushed forward and he neutralised the bunker. Cooper was later commissioned following this VC action here, and he didn't serve again at the front for the remainder of the war. And when he came home, he rarely spoke about the war, and he certainly did not speak about the fact that he'd been awarded the Victoria Cross. In the 1980s, Channel 4, when it started, one of its very earliest commissions was a history of the Victoria Cross, and Cooper was featured in this series. And for many people, some of them who'd known him decades, they were astonished to see him on television talking about his exploits as a soldier in the Great War and being awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest medal for gallantry in the trenches of Flanders. So we'll continue along the Donkerweg now, and that'll take us gradually downhill towards that little valley which the Steenbeek River runs through, and then we'll reach the main road, we'll cross that, and that'll take us to a little memorial plaque right by the Steenbeek. This little memorial stone here commemorates Harry Patch, the last fighting Tommy. Harry Patch has come to symbolise really the veterans, the generation almost of the Great War, by virtue of the fact that he was the last man who fought here in the trenches of the Western Front to die. He was the last man standing. He passed away in July 2009, and with him closed a chapter of the Great War. As we often say on this podcast, the last page of the history of the Great War will probably never be written, but that was a definitive moment in its history with the passing of a man like Harry Patch. Like many men who had fought in the Great War, Harry was very reluctant to talk about his experiences. He kept it locked away for a very long time. He'd not even kept the medals that he'd been issued for his service in the war, and he had no photographs of himself in uniform. It was only when that remarkable oral historian Richard Van Emden came along that Harry was finally persuaded to talk about his war. He had said steadfastly that he didn't want to ever return to the battlefields, but Richard persuaded him, and in return he did. In those final years of his life, when you look at what he did, it felt almost as if this was a mission for him to continue to return for as long as that was possible, and he made sure it was possible, right up to almost the point that he died in July of 2009. Richard's book on Harry Patch, The Last Fighting Tommy, is highly recommended, and I'll put a link to it on the Old Front Line website, oldfrontline.co.uk. I didn't know Harry Patch. I met him once, but he wasn't a veteran that I could say that I knew. By the time that I met Harry, I'd actually actively stopped trying to trace veterans of the Great War, and some of you listening to this might think that was a bit odd, really. But many of these veterans became friends. They became very, very good friends, and they were a generation that even in the 80s and 90s were passing, and I found myself going to a lot of funerals, saying goodbye to a lot of good friends, and it hurts. It really hurt to say goodbye to some of these men like Malcolm Vivian, Harry Coates and George Butler. So I stopped looking for them, and I don't entirely regret that for all sorts of reasons, because I realised how lucky I was to speak to the several hundred that I did have a chance to sit and talk with and interview. Harry Patch's war was really quite a short one, and when I compare the things that he did to some of the veterans that I interviewed, there really is no comparison. But Harry has come to symbolise these men, symbolise the veterans of that war, and that's a good thing. He's a face that even the most uninterested person in the Great War is likely to recognise. His is a voice they're likely to have heard, and it's brought through him a greater public consciousness of the Great War, and that has to be welcomed. There was talk of a state funeral for Harry after he died, with queens and commanders, but to me that doesn't seem to be the sort of man that Harry was, and this simple memorial here, located close to the Steenbeek River, close to that railway line that we saw on the embankment a little bit further up, which is now a cycle track. This was Harry's approach to the battlefield in 1917 when he took part in the Third Battle of Ypres. It's a simple memorial, to an ordinary man in these extraordinary circumstances of the Great War, and perhaps, as such, that makes it one of the greatest memorials that we'll ever find on these battlefields. So with thoughts of Harry, we continue along this little track back onto the main road. We turn right past the big modern factory into the outskirts of Langemarck village. Langemarck, like all of these villages here on the old Ypres salient, the old Ypres battlefields, was smashed to oblivion by the end of the First World War, with the fighting here during the gas attack in 1915, complete destruction during the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917, and fighting here twice in the spring and in the late summer of 1918. Nothing remained of this village, but like many others here, it rose like a phoenix from the ashes, and Langemarck was restored. But we'll walk through it, keeping the old cycle track, the old railway line to our right, go past the old Langemarck railway station until we reach Clerkenstraat a little bit further up. Here turn left and then walk out of the village until we reach the German cemetery ahead of us on the left-hand side. Langemarck German Cemetery is probably the most visited German cemetery of the First World War. During the First World War centenary, I would guess that several million people came here between 2014 and 2018. And for many people, it is their first and perhaps their only contact with the dead of the other side of the battlefield, the other side of the wire. Most of these visitors will be English-speaking, not German, and for them it will be in great contrast to the Commonwealth cemeteries that they've seen. A common comments by people who come here on tour groups like the ones that I've brought here over many years is that it's dark, foreboding, depressing, and very different. And it is a cemetery that fascinates people, but there's a great deal of mythology connected to it. There are more than 44,000 German soldiers buried here, half of them in a mass grave. And the sort of comments that I've heard over the years is that when you look at this cemetery, you can tell the Germans didn't care for their dead, or that they were forced to commemorate their dead in this way, that they dug a big pit after the war and threw most of the bodies in there. I mean, these are dreadful statements, but this is the sort of thing that I've heard over the years. So what is the real history of Langemarck Cemetery? What do we know of the German approach to burials in this part of the First World War battlefields? And what is the symbolism of Langemarck? First of all, what was the situation with German cemeteries in Belgium, in Flanders, during the First World War? Well, by 1918, there were 678 different locations where there were German war cemeteries. Many of these were on the battlefield, some of them were close to the sites of where the Germans had their medical facilities. Just like our cemeteries that were close to casualty clearing stations, German soldiers died of their wounds as well. And cemeteries grew up around the establishment and the location of those medical units. So what we see is that there was not an insignificant number of German cemeteries across the battlefields in Belgium. By the time of the Second World War, that number, just like with British cemeteries, around Ypres there was about 550 British cemeteries, and they were concentrated into 174. With the Germans, those 678 locations were concentrated into 128 cemeteries in different parts of Belgium, many of them in Flanders. So while many people coming to Langemarck might believe that this was the only German cemetery or one of only a few, in fact, as we can see, there was quite a lot, and this is just Belgium. However, what then changes things is the Second World War, the outcome of the Second World War. With the fall of the Third Reich and the division of Germany between West and East, in the years following the Second World War, the responsibility of war graves rested with West Germany, and with the equivalent German War Graves organisation, the equivalent of what was then the Imperial War Graves Commission. In this case for the Germans, it was the VDK, the Volksbund Deutscher Kriegsgräberversorger, or Volksbund for short. With Germany in ruin after 6 years of war and an economy in near collapse, money for the upkeep of graves from the previous conflicts, as well as this latest one, really was not a major consideration for the West German government. So a decision was made by the Volksbunds in the post-war period to close the vast majority of German cemeteries from the First World War in Belgium and also in France and in other nations where they were located, and moved them into main concentration sites. So this meant that in Belgium, those 678 locations that existed at the end of the First World War, which had been reduced then to 128, were now reduced further to 4, and those sites being Menin, Vladslo, Hooghlede, and here at Langemarck. Now, there were Germans buried in British and Commonwealth cemeteries. There are a number of cemeteries in Flanders that contained many German burials, some of them almost as many German burials as British ones. But in terms of cemeteries that are directly maintained by the Volksbund, it is these 4. And that equated, with these 4 sites combined, to over 135,000 German burials from the First World War. Now, that's not their total of dead, because the one difference between the Volksbund and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission is that there is no commemoration of the missing. The missing from the German army who fell in Flanders and other parts of the Western Front are not commemorated on any memorials that are the equivalent to the Meningate, Thiepval, Loos. It just doesn't exist for the German army. German soldiers are commemorated on local war memorials all over Germany, but there is no monument that commemorates those men with no known grave. So it means that on every German battlefield of the Great War, just like ours, 50% of the dead, sometimes more than that, are missing, and there is nothing to see of these men, no trace of them. And in parts of Germany that reverted to being Polish territory after the Second World War, towns and cities where Germans had lived for several centuries and which at the time of the First World War had war memorials, those war memorials were understandably dismantled in the post-Second World War period. And many German civil cemeteries that contain memorials to the dead of the First World War were cleared and then reused, plaques in churches were removed. So really, if any generation of the Great War is a lost generation, it is that of Germany, that nearly 2 million dead from the Great War. Many of them have entirely disappeared from history. Many casualty lists for the First World War were damaged or destroyed in the Second, and the removal of war memorials and monuments to these men in the towns and cities and villages where they once lived means that there is no trace of them at all, particularly if they are missing soldiers. Their homeland, their Heimat, has gone, understandably, given the circumstances of the German nation's activities in a good proportion of the 20th century. But of course, again, it makes a great contrast to the dead from Britain and the Commonwealth. So let's look at the history of Langemarck German Cemetery itself. The cemetery here was created from a small group of graves that had been made in 1915. This area had seen fighting in the First Battle of Ypres, but the ground here had not been captured during that race to the sea. In the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, the Germans used poison gas here for the first time. Langemarck was then defended by French troops, and the Germans broke through on this front. The front line actually was very close to the far side of where Langemarck German Cemetery is today, and this was one of the points at which poison gas was released from. The cemetery here at that time was known as Langemarck Nord, Langemarck North, and additional burials were later made as the front line moved forward towards the Ypres Canal, and it became one of 15 German cemeteries in this immediate area around the village of Langemarck. As the fighting in Flanders moved into the year of 1917, and eventually the Third Battle of Ypres would pass across this ground, the Germans fortified the positions around Langemarck and installed 3 bunkers in the area close to the cemetery. And the cemetery now, in many respects, was in the way of a defensive line, but there was no attempt to remove the graves and move them elsewhere. The defences just ran through the far part of where the cemetery was located. The ground here, both in that year and the subsequent fighting of 1918, was pretty much pulverised by bombardments, and it's remarkable that this cemetery survived, but survive it did. And the cemetery was made permanent in 1920, and graves here were marked individually. Again, this is an important point to make, really, because German cemeteries of this period of the war itself and in the post-war period, graves were marked individually. There was no collective graves, no mass graves, no multiple burials in the same grave. These men were honoured individually, often with quite ornate graves. In the case of Langemarck, the contemporary photographs we have show that whatever graves may have once been there during the war were probably smashed to bits by the shell fire of the later battles, and then post-war those individual graves were marked by wooden crosses. In 1930, the Volksbund took over the cemetery permanently, and it was then known by one of several names: Langemarck Nord, its old name from the war, the Studentenfriedhof, more of why it was called that shortly, or the German military cemetery number 123. The initial design for the cemetery was then worked on, and the work to make that permanent and realise it took place from 1933 onwards, although the cemetery was officially inaugurated by the German government on the 10th of July 1932. At that stage, the German cemetery at Langemarck comprised of 10,143 burials, of which 6,313 were identified, so the majority of the men buried here were known soldiers. Now, at the time this cemetery was being worked on in the 1930s, this was a somewhat key period in the history of Germany in the 20th century, because Adolf Hitler had just come to power, and it's that connection to the history of the Third Reich that makes this part of Langemarck's story somewhat disconcerting. When Hitler came to power, Langemarck was already a famous battle honour of the German army in the Great War, and there was already a degree of mythology about it. It was seen as a battle of the death of the innocents, that Studentensoldaten, student soldiers, had marched into battle arm in arm, singing Deutschland über alles, which incidentally was not the German national anthem at that time, and had been slaughtered. Linking the identity of the fallen in that battle to the Studentensoldaten was a powerful one, because Germany was a conscript army. It did not have a need for volunteers in the same way the British Army did in 1914, but the students were largely volunteers, young men who had enlisted straight from school or college or university and marched straight to the front. And Hitler used this as a classic example of how the German nation had been betrayed by the states in the First World War, that here was the cream of Germany marched into a futile and costly battle that had resulted in their deaths, and for Hitler this must never happen again. And Langemarck took on a great symbolism within the Nazi Germany world. There were Langemarck Strasses, Langemarck streets in many German towns, Langemarck Schule, Langemarck schools, and one of the bells in the 1936 Olympic Stadium was also a Langemarck bell after this battle, after this cemetery, and after those losses. But the truth was very different. There were, of course, some student soldiers who had died in that battle, and some of them are buried in this cemetery, but nowhere near on the levels that Hitler and many others proclaimed. This was all part of building that myth of the betrayal of Germany, of betrayal of the German nation, which of course was part of Hitler's routes to power in the 1920s and 30s. The construction and the eventual layout of the permanent cemetery was all part of that 1930s attempt to make this into a Heldenfeld, a hero's field, a common term that you see for German cemeteries of the First World War, and that took on perhaps a slightly stronger meaning in the Nazi period. The construction saw the building of an entrance that had two chambers, one showing a map of Belgium and the location of German cemeteries, and another listing the names of German servicemen who were buried in the original cemetery. And this did include many Studentensoldaten, many student soldiers. As you came through this entrance, you were in a little courtyard, and there were fixtures on the wall where wreaths could hang. I'll put some pictures of what the original German cemetery at Langemarck looked like on the Old Front Line website, oldfrontline.co.uk. So when you came into this little courtyard, that's where the wreaths were. But above you, the first thing that you saw was a plaque. And it was a plaque in bronze on which were the words, Deutschland muss leben und wenn wir sterben müssen. Germany must live even if we must die. It was reputedly one of Hitler's favourite sayings. From here you turned right and went through a big bronze gate along a path lined by trees and bushes into the main area of the Heldenfeld, of the heroes' field of the cemetery, and that's where the 10,000 dead were buried. Planted among them were oak trees, the trees planted on the graves of warriors. For Germans, these men were not Soldaten, not soldiers, they were Krieger, they were warriors. And these great oaks were the sort of trees that were planted on the graves of such warriors. The bunkers that had been here during the war were cleaned up and given a new surface. Many people think that because of how clean they look, they must be copies or fakes. They are original bunkers on the original site, and they are easily mappable using the Great War Linesman digital software that enables you to use GPS with wartime trench maps. In between the bunkers was a series of blocks. I've seen some people describe these as anti-tank blocks. I can assure you that they are not. They were built to house plaques of different regiments and divisions and comrade associations. Not all of them were used by the outbreak of the Second World War. But what they also did was delineate the cemetery, because the bunkers were cleaned up and the blocks were put in place symbolically. To symbolise what? Well, to symbolise the front line in Flanders. If you look at the outline where the blocks are, they roughly follow the line from the coast down to the French border, right across the Flanders battlefields. And the three bunkers symbolise, in many respects, the three main towns where the German army were fighting on this part of the battlefield. Newport up towards the coast, Dixmude and Ypres, or Ypres as the Germans called it, where most of their troops were fighting during those 4 years of war. Behind the bunkers, behind the blocks, behind this front line delineation was the Heldenfeld, the heroes' field, the cemetery. But what was beyond it? Well, that was a bit of rough ground. Wild ground full of wild flowers. It's described as no man's land or the poppy field, and just beyond that was a moat ditch, an area of water on the corner of which there was a mound with a cross. The moat ditch symbolised the North Sea and Channel coast. The poppy field was no man's land. The bunkers and the blocks was the battlefield, and behind that was the dead who'd sacrificed their lives to defend their Heimat, their homeland. And all of this, together with the Deutschland muss leben plaque, sat very well, very nicely with the outlook of the German government in the 1930s. The idea that Germany must live even if we must die was terribly put into practice once more in 1939 when Nazi Germany went to war. By the summer of 1940, its forces had stamped their way across most of Europe, and Belgium was now occupied. Adolf Hitler came here at that time. He tried to associate himself with the fighting at Langemarck, claimed that he was a veteran of the battle when he wasn't. But he came here in 1940 to visit this hero's field, to visit Langemarck, to visit this great potent symbol of sacrifice of the best of Germany in the previous war. And he was extensively photographed and filmed while he was here. During the war, German occupying forces came to visit Langemarck, and some of the photographs that I'll put on the Old Frontline website are ones taken by those German occupying forces at this time. In September 1944, the Allies returned. D-Day had brought them across France and into Belgium, and Belgium was free once more. And in that post-war world, Langemarck changed greatly, and the symbolic design that had once been here was lost forever. In Flanders, the change took place between 1956 and 1958, when all those German cemeteries that had been in Flanders were closed and moved into the four larger ones. 24,917 men were reburied in a new mass grave that was created in Langemarck Cemetery. Now these were men who had been individually buried in previous cemeteries that were closed and their bodies moved in to a burial chamber, not a pit, a burial chamber. An ossuary, the French would call it. So once buried side by side, buried in individual graves with often very ornate grave markers, these men were now part of a massive collective burial. No man's land, the poppy fields, was now reused for burials, and in that 1950s period, 10,000 German soldiers were now buried in this part of the cemetery. And those graves came from locations like Passchendaele, Zonnebeek and Zillebeek, where German cemeteries had existed, and these were now closed and moved here. Eventually, the total ran to 44,304 burials by the time this work was complete. But Langemarck is not the largest German cemetery, and again, that's one of the myths when people come here. Actually, that's Menin, with over 48,000 burials. But it does have the largest mass grave of any of the German cemeteries. One of the features that was added to the cemetery at this time overlooking the mass grave was the Trauerenden Soldaten. These were the figures made by sculptor Emil Krieger in 1956 and were based on the concept of a German military funeral where soldiers were singing "I had a comrade, ich hatte einen Kameraden." Here these comrades overlooked the men now buried in the mass grave. In 1971, the individual grave markers that remained in the cemetery were all removed. Again, this was down to cost. It was too costly to keep these individual graves, so plaques replaced them, plaques that listed a dozen, sometimes more than a dozen names. The men were not reburied, they're all still buried in individual graves, but the plaques commemorate multiple numbers of soldiers in the same row. So while I have heard many people describe to groups of visitors here that these plaques symbolise mini mass graves, this is not the case. One of the issues that the Volksbund had with the mass grave is that there was nothing now to say who was buried in it, and that took incredibly until the 1980s, when plaques were finally placed around the edge of the mass grave with bronze panels listing those known to be buried in there. And those plaques now commemorate 17,342 of the 24,917 men buried in the mass grave. And they also include 2 British soldiers. A recent plaque placed on the edge of one of the memorial columns lists 2 men who were originally buried in German cemeteries. They died as prisoners of war, and their graves were erroneously moved here by the Volksbund when those cemeteries were closed in the 1950s and the burials brought to Langemarck. When I first visited Langemarck with my school in 1982, the design had not changed since the cemetery was remade in the 1950s. But in 1984, it was redesigned. The wall on which the plaque with Deutschland muss leben on it was removed. The figures were taken to the far wall of the cemetery and turned round to face the mass grave. The plaque was moved to above the entrance to almost hide it away, perhaps. But things have a habit of going full circle, and during the First World War centenary, further work took place to restore the courtyard entrance as you came through the main building, and then move the Emil Krieger figures back to the points where they'd originally overlooked the mass grave. In recent years, the number of burials here has increased because there's been a lot of battlefield archaeology across Flanders, and the remains of German soldiers have been found by the diggers in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, and recently with the Hill 80 project. The archaeologist Simon Verdigam, overseeing that project, discovered a significant German burial ground, and the men were eventually reburied here. So like the cemeteries, the British cemeteries of the Great War, the last page has yet to be turned here. It's been an evolving cemetery. It's changed as the German nation has changed. It commemorates these men on the other side of the wire, on the other side of no man's land. For us, it helps humanise the enemy. We can see them here. We can reach out and touch their names when we visit. And it's important on anyone's visit to the battlefields of Flanders, on any battlefield of the Great War, to come and pay their respects to German cemeteries like this. The British veterans that I interviewed in the 1980s had a great deal of respect for the German soldier in the Great War. They knew that they shared the same privations as them. Many of them would talk fondly about old Jerry or Fritz. They would fight them, they would kill them if they had to. That was war, but they respected them. German soldiers marched into battle, many of them, wearing a belt buckle that read, "Gott mit uns," God is with us. And they believed that in exactly the same way as our men did. So it's right to remember these German soldiers, remember them and understand them, see the Germany that they stood for, understand where that German nation's borders were, borders that now have shrunk or have gone altogether. And it is important when you come here to Langemarck to understand how its story weaves into that of the next World War, because the whole thread, really, the whole thread of Langemarck weaves right through the middle of 20th century history. and casts long shadows across the old front line. It's that part of the podcast where we look at an object connected to the Great War, and I know we haven't done this for a while, but this week's one, as it's connected to the history of the German army, it seemed appropriate to include that in this podcast about Langemarck. And I'm really grateful to podcast listener Yang Fröhling, who very kindly sent me this object. What it is a model 1917 German artillery signal lamp. It's not a massive lamp, but it's an electric lamp. It's made out of metal, and it's got a manufacturer on it, Bernhard Röger Berlin. And when you look into Bernhard Röger, you discover that he was a German naval officer in the First World War. He served on a merchant raider, and in fact he served in both the First and the Second World War, and later as an admiral in the Bundesmarine after World War II, dying in 1982. So he designed this lamp as a signalling lamp, probably for the Navy, but obviously it had use on the ground as well. And communications in the First World War was a key element. The First World War was a modern war, a truly modern war, with 20th century technology, weapons and weaponry and equipment, but with one exception. And that exception really was communications. It was a modern war fought with communication systems from the previous century. So there were no radios that could easily be transported and used on a battlefield, and static communications like telephones and in this case signalling lamps had to be used. Now this one is not quite pocket size, but it could easily be put into a knapsack or a backpack, and it's electrically powered, so there's a compartment that opens and the battery is inside. It's then got 3 different coloured lamps, and I'll just unscrew the lamp covers, and this one has got a blue, a green and a white bulb. Looking online, I see that some of them also have a red bulb as well, and it's got 3 terminals, which I would guess that you would attach a Morse key to that, and then you would use this to signal back or signal forward to positions on the battlefield. It's got a little handle to carry it, and it's got a loop on the back that you could put onto a belt or a set of equipment. So it's a portable battlefield signalling lamp, similar in terms of design and size and so on to the British Lucas lamp that was used extensively by battalion signallers and also Royal Engineers signallers on the other side of the battlefield in the First World War. So this bit of kit, dating from 1917, would have been used in that final phase of the First World War, not, I suspect, just by artillery units, although communications in artillery units was incredibly important to keep a line open to an observer on the ground, watching the fall of shot from an artillery unit further away and correcting that fire by sending a message back to the battery, back to the artillery unit, using a system like this. The Germans had relay posts, Blinksteller. Blinksteller, directly translated, is a flashing point. So it's a position where you'd set up signalling equipment like this and flash Morse back to the next relay point and then onwards to headquarters. And there are several surviving Blinkstellers on the Western Front. A few come to mind. One in particular is on the wall of the chateau at Flesquières on the Cambrai battlefields. And I think hopefully next year, when we have this chance once more to return to the old front line, I plan to take this signalling lamp to one of those Blinkstellers and put it in place just as a sort of a symbolic thing, really, just to take a bit of kit that was once used in a place like that back to where it may once have been. This particular example ended up in the Netherlands, and I really want to thank Arjan for being so kind and generous in sending this to me. It sits on my shelf now as not only a reminder of the Great War, an object that connects us to the Great War, but also of those of you, all of you, who support this podcast by listening, by joining us on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee, and who are in contact with me on a regular basis. It's always really good to hear from you, and your generosity in time and otherwise is very, very much appreciated. So a little object to connect us to the German army in this podcast, and I hope to begin discussing objects again on a more regular basis. Having moved in the summer, the artefacts were a little bit all over the place, but I've solved that problem now. So more artefacts soon. And I'll put some photographs of the signalling lamp onto the podcast website, oldfrontline.co.uk. I've not been able to find a manual for this or any other technical information, so if anybody listening can supply that or can point me in the direction of it, I would be truly grateful. So Arjan, thank you again, my friend, and I look forward to shaking your hand next year and buying you a cold beer when we're back on the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.